Deforestation is the conversion of forests to other land uses, whether it's made by humans or natural factors. And it is identified ever since the start of humans using woods to create products. In terms of studies of global or regional deforestations, most studies only focus on analyzing global-wise deforestation status and situations without looking at specific countries and regions and their relationships. And some of the studies mostly focus on only analyzing one region without any broader views and other interconnections. So that creates a kind of a gap that can be used by media and other sources to create misinformation, to mislead audience and readers to believe what the media want them to believe. So the study aimed to present the status of deforestation in both two measures. First is from global perspective, and the second part is the regional studies, where I chose 5 of the representatives to analyze further trends and something that can be used by media to cause misinformation. So for the first part of the study, I used the data from the United Nations of Forest Resources, in which most of the countries around the world were examined in terms of deforestation status and annual forest changes from 2000 to 2010. So according to most of the media and the sources, most of the graphs using in data visualizations that represent the deforestation use 2 kinds of variables. The first one is to show the annual differences in forest area, which is shown in absolute differences, like in units of 1,000 hectares or something like that. And the second one is to show the data using the percentage of annual forest area change in percentage to the land area. So from the first graph, we can see that some countries like China and USA and India have some of the most forest growth annually from 2000 to 2010. And countries like Brazil and Angola, they have the largest forest decrease in the past 10 years. But when we look at the percentage of the forest change, like in the second graph, things are totally different. Countries like Vietnam and Spain and Paraguay and Myanmar, they all presented in prominent places instead of China and Brazil, which are rounded up in the third places in terms of the graph representation. And similarly, we can see that when we use different kind of calculations to different graphs, like in the second graph, we use the forest area change in percentage of the land area. Media can also use things like populations or the annual forest areas change in percentage to their resources or in percentage to their populations. And it's obvious that when using different kind of calculations and variables to present the same bar graph with the same countries, the image can be totally different, and the countries that are in the leading places of forest growth and in the first places of the forest decrease can be totally different. And when using that kind of variables, media can present the graph to the populations without emphasizing the actual calculations and variables used in this graph in goals of misleading the audience to believe what they want them to believe. And in the box plots down below, we can see the trends that are more obvious than the bar graphs. And from the first box plot, where it shows the absolute differences of forest growth and forest decrease in all the countries in this 10 years, we can see that China and Brazil are in extreme outlier places, while other 200 countries are in the middle parts. And in the second box plot, we can see that when the variables and calculations shifts from absolute values to relative values, which is in this context, forest change in percentage of land area, we can see that the countries that are in prominent places shifted drastically, where China and Brazil are blended in to the most of the populations in the middle, and some of the countries like Nicaragua and Paraguay and Puerto Rico, they all ended up in places that are more prominent. And in terms of audience, they only want to perceive the information that are in prominent place, practically nobody will notice all of the countries in the middle. All of them want you to see the data points on the two extreme sides. So that can create the illusion that media want to show to the audience to mislead their thoughts. For the second part of my studies, 5 regions are selected: Brazil, Cambodia, China, Vietnam, and Russia. The standard to choose these 5 countries is that they all have some sorts of prominent places shown in the global part of the study. So we want to use this different kind of features in terms of forest area, land area, and populations in these countries to show how regional studies can be used to mislead audience by media. So during the research, I found that the United Nations actually include all kinds of variables to calculate the actual forest area and its definition to all of the countries around the world. One of the most influential variable is forest threshold, which is a value that defines area with more tree canopy density than its value as forest. For example, we choose a forest threshold of 10%. It means that places that have a tree canopy density more than 10% are counted as forest, whereas when we choose a threshold of 75%, only areas that have tree density more than 75% are counted as forest. So when we see that we applied the 2 thresholds to the 5 countries, we can see that there are drastic differences in many of them. For example, when we choose to look at Russia, when we use a forest threshold of 10%, it has the most forest coverage than all of the other countries, whereas when we choose shift to 75%, it decreases like 2/3 of its forest area's definition, which is practically below the Brazil forest area. So it brings us with the question that is there actually more tree numbers in Russia than in those in Brazil, because we can see that because there is a drastic decrease of forest definition when we raise up the forest threshold, which means that Brazil actually have more dense area of forests than Russia. So it's possible that although with a lower forest threshold, Brazil seems to have a lower coverage of forests than Russia, it's possible that because of its density, Brazil actually have more tree numbers than Russia, but it's indefinite and we cannot determine that. But media can totally use this kind of differences and discrepancy between the forest threshold to present their idea. And another problem raised by this discrepancy of different forest threshold is the quality of reforestation. For example, China has been implementing reforestation over the past decades. It seems that they have got some very significant progress in reforestation, but when we compare the forest area of 10% forest threshold to 75% forest threshold, we can see that there's a large difference between the 2 of them, which can mean that the quality of reforestation can be a concern, and also there is the problem of forest resistibility, because in most of the reforestation process, people only use one type of trees, which can make the artificial forest really susceptible to disease and disasters. And another 3D maps of forest gain, loss, and area also infers that forests are actually shrinking, because we can see in all of the 5 countries that regions with less primary forests actually show growth, while most districts with more forest area actually suffer more tree clearance. So when media wanted to focus on the forest growth, they can actually filter out all of the regions with more forest area and only look at regions with less forest area, and show that people actually gained some forest growth in the past decades. So in conclusion, we can see that ambiguous displays of forest areas can change the audience's mind and confuse them to believe what the media provide them to see. And this kind of graphs are misleading, and without learning the threshold and other data perceiving and analytical skills, audience cannot include all variables when they are looking out at all of the graphs and can be easily misled by other sources of data visualizations. So it's important to understand the nature of deforestation, and it's also essential for teams and regions to learn severeness and emphasize replanting quality, and they need to allocate resources logically based on multiple angles. And in perspective of media, they absolutely need to cite their sources, and also they need to provide information for audience about all they use, whether it's for threshold or other variables that can make significant difference in the graph's outcomes. And in terms of audience, they also need to learn about thinking analytically and thinking critically about all of the data visualizations on internet and in all of the medias.